For most of human history, the past has been understood through fragments. Stones, shaped by hands long gone, bones preserved by chance, layers of earth that quietly record what once existed on the surface. Archaeology does not tell stories in full sentences. It offers partial records, measured carefully, and placed in time. Across the world, evidence has been uncovered that pushes human activity further back than once believed. Some of it fits neatly into established timelines. Some of it does not. Dates shift, classifications change, gaps remain. In this documentary, we examine what the material record actually shows. Not speculation, not conclusions drawn ahead of evidence, only what has been found, how it was measured, and where it fits or fails to fit within the accepted framework of human history. This is an examination of civilizations before written memory. Not as legend, but as constrained, physical evidence preserved in stone, sediment, and time, beneath the oldest layers of record. Long before written language, long before agriculture, the only history that remains is physical. It sits in sediment, in cave floors, in river terraces, and in volcanic ash that cooled and sealed what was on the ground at a particular hour. The work of reconstructing that time depends on field notes, measured sections, labelled bags, and dates attached to specific layers. In the 20th century, teams began to build a shared timeline using radiocarbon dating, potassium-argon dating, and later argon-argon methods, along with thermoluminescence and optically stimulated luminescence. Each method has limits and calibration steps, and each is tied to a context. The context is the difference between an object as evidence and an object as a curiosity. East Africa holds some of the clearest early sequences, because volcanic activity repeatedly left datable horizons across wide areas. In northern Tanzania, at Olduvai Gorge, Louis and Mary Leakey worked through the mid-century on stratified beds where stone tools and animal bones appeared in place. Their publications described horizons that later became reference points for Oldowan toolmaking. Associated with early members of the genus Homo, and sometimes with Paranthropus in nearby contexts. In Ethiopia's Afar region, the Hadar and Omo areas produced hominin fossils and stone artifacts in sediments bracketed by volcanic tuffs. Names used for these finds became familiar in the literature, like the Hadar specimen catalogued as AL 288-1, reported in 1974, and the Omo fossils from formations mapped and dated in subsequent decades. The point of these sites is not any single object, but a repeatable pattern of association between tools, butchery marks, and datable layers. Stone tools from the lower Paleolithic carry a quiet kind of information. An Oldowan flake is often simple, with sharp edges made by striking a core, but it still reflects selection and planning. An Acheulean hand axe, with a more symmetrical shape, shows a different tradition, found across large parts of Africa and Eurasia. The chronological placement of these industries relies on the layers around them, not on the shape alone. At Kubifora, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, and at sites in the Ethiopian Rift, researchers described sequences where tool types, fauna, and sedimentology can be compared across distances. Similar comparisons appear in the Levant, including at Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, where evidence for repeated occupation and use of fire has been discussed in the context of early human dispersals. Fire in these settings is treated cautiously, with criteria for in situ burning, microcharcoal, and spatial clustering, because wildfires can leave similar traces. Europe's early record was not built in a single place, but in scattered caves, river gravels, and limestone systems. In northern Spain, the Atapuerca sites near Burgos became central after systematic excavations expanded in the late 20th century. Cima de los Huesos produced a large collection of hominin remains in a deep chamber, with interpretations that have shifted over time as dating and comparative anatomy improved. The site is known for its scale and for the way a single deposit can alter discussions about Neanderthal ancestry. Farther north and east, assemblages from France, Germany, and the Balkans added stone tools, faunal remains, and later, human fossils. The record is uneven because glaciation reshaped landscapes, and because preservation favours caves and certain soils. When gaps appear in the sequence, they often reflect what survived and what has been found, not a clean absence of life. Caves carry another kind of archive. because they accumulate slowly and protect materials from surface erosion. In South Africa, Blombos Cave drew attention for engraved ochre pieces and shell beads associated with early Homo sapiens levels. The work there, and at nearby sites, relied on careful stratigraphy and multiple dating approaches because coastal caves can be disturbed by water movement, roof fall, and bioturbation. In France, Chauvet Cave, with its painted animals, was dated through radiocarbon of charcoal and other analyses, placing it far earlier than many expected when it was publicized in the 1990 seconds. The meaning of such art is not settled by age alone, but the dates changed how archaeologists describe the range of symbolic behavior. A date is attached to a sample is attached to a place, and the place is mapped in the layer sequence. In Siberia, the Denisova cave sequence added a different category of evidence when genetic work on bone fragments identified a distinct population now known as Denisovans. That identification came from laboratory methods rather than clear skeletal features, and it reshaped how Eurasian prehistory is described. The cave also holds layers with tools, ornaments, and repeated occupation, and its deposits have been dated using a combination of methods suited to cave sediments. What survives from a population can be a tooth, a finger bone, or a genetic signal carried in living people. None of that requires an advanced lost society to be significant. It requires only time, movement, and enough preservation for traces to remain. Across these sites, the phrase "before humanity" depends on the definition used. In many academic contexts, humanity can mean Homo sapiens, while human can refer to the broader genus Homo, or even to hominin ancestors. The material record shows that toolmaking and controlled use of space long predate Homo sapiens. The record also shows that the past was not a straight line from simple to complex, because complexity depends on ecology, population size, and contact between groups. In some regions, technological traditions persisted for long spans with gradual modifications, and in others, rapid change appears over shorter intervals. These shifts are often linked to climate proxies taken from ice cores, marine sediments, and pollen records, which provide a separate timeline of environmental change that can be compared to archaeological horizons. There are also cases where objects became famous because they were presented as out of place. The so-called Piltdown remains in England were accepted by some as an ancient human ancestor before being exposed as a deliberate forgery in 1953 through chemical tests and reassessment. That episode is now part of the discipline's internal cautionary history. A different class of claims involves items described as impossibly old in popular accounts, often without verifiable context, such as isolated artifacts with unclear provenance or finds recovered from disturbed ground. Professional fieldwork treats provenance as central, because a tool found in a surface pile cannot be reliably tied to a specific time. When errors enter the record, they are usually corrected by new measurements, new excavations, or improved lab techniques, leaving a paper trail of debate rather than a clean story. Loss of evidence happens in ordinary ways. River valleys that preserve terraces also flood and cut new channels, taking older deposits with them. Coastal sites can be submerged as sea levels rise, and they can be exposed again only briefly by erosion. War and development have removed sites before they were documented, and older excavations sometimes left incomplete notes that later researchers cannot fully reconstruct. Museum collections have also been reorganized, moved, or separated from their original documentation, especially during the colonial period, creating breaks between objects and the field records that give them meaning. When archaeologists describe an erased past, it often refers to these processes, along with the simple fact that most organic materials decay. A quieter kind of erasure comes from the limits of what the ground preserves. Wooden structures, fibre, and skin rarely survive over long spans except in special conditions such as extreme cold, dryness, or waterlogging. Stone, fired clay, and bone last longer, but even they are altered by chemistry and pressure. The earliest phases of any settlement pattern could be represented only by scatters of flakes, a hearth stain, and cut marks on bone. A later city can leave foundations and streets. Between those extremes are long stretches where people lived, moved, and died, leaving traces that are small, scattered, and easy to miss. Within that reality, the pre-sapiens record still shows repeated signs of planning and social learning. Tool traditions imply teaching and imitation. Transport of raw materials implies foresight and shared routes. Hearth patterns and reused living surfaces imply routines. The evidence is not a single monument or a single cache, but a cumulative set of modest signals across continents and time spans. It is the kind of record that grows by slow addition, as more sites are mapped, redated, and compared. The oldest layers remain quiet, and the discipline that studies them tends to match that quietness, because most claims are only as strong as the stratigraphy and the dates that hold them in place. The caves that kept names without writing. Caves entered the archaeological record early because they are visible, bounded, and often dry. Long before systematic excavation, travelers and local residents noticed bones, stone tools, and ash layers exposed in cave floors and walls. When archaeology formalized as a discipline in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, caves became controlled spaces where depth could be measured in centimeters and deposits could be peeled back in order. Each layer was recorded as it appeared, not as it was expected to appear, because caves often preserve sequences that are uneven, compressed, or interrupted. What matters in these settings is continuity, not spectacle. In southern France, caves in the Dordogne region were among the first to be excavated with attention to stratigraphy. Sites such as La Ferracie, Le Moustier, and Pech de Lazay revealed repeated occupations stretching across tens of thousands of years. Stone tools, hearth remains, and animal bones were found resting directly on earlier floors, separated only by thin lenses of sediment. These layers were later re-examined as dating methods improved, correcting early assumptions and refining timelines. The caves themselves did not change, but the way their contents were measured did. Labels attached to artifacts were revised as methods such as radiocarbon calibration curves and sediment analysis developed through the 20th century. In the Levant, caves served as anchors for understanding long-term human presence outside Africa. Excavations beginning in the 1932 and continuing decades later documented repeated use of the cave as a habitation site. Ash layers, concentrations of burned bone, and spatial patterning of tools suggested organized activity areas. The dating of these layers relied on a combination of radiocarbon, uranium series dating on speleothems, and stratigraphic correlation with nearby sites. The importance of Kibara lies not in a single fossil, but in the consistency of occupation evidence across layers that could be independently dated. Further east, Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq provided another long sequence, excavated primarily in the mid-20th century. The site became widely known after Neanderthal skeletal remains were uncovered, some of them associated with pollen concentrations that were initially interpreted as evidence of deliberate burial practices. Later reassessment questioned aspects of that interpretation, suggesting alternative explanations for the pollen distribution. What remained unchanged was the basic stratigraphy of the cave and the presence of multiple occupation phases. The discussion around Shanidar illustrates how interpretation can shift while the physical record stays fixed. In southern Africa, caves and rock shelters played a similar role, but under different environmental conditions. Clay's Rivermouth Caves on the South African coast preserve deposits spanning the Middle Stone Age. Excavations beginning in the 1962 documented layers containing stone tools, shellfish remains, and human fossils attributed to early Homo sapiens. The sediments accumulated under conditions influenced by sea level changes, meaning that occupation intensity varied with access to coastal resources. Dating combined radiocarbon for younger layers and other methods for older deposits, creating a framework that linked human presence to climatic cycles rather than to abrupt cultural breaks. Blombo's Cave, also in South Africa, extended this pattern with well-preserved Middle Stone Age layers. Its significance emerged from careful excavation and analysis rather than from the size of the site. Engraved ochre fragments, shell beads, and bone tools were recovered from layers dated using multiple methods, including optically stimulated luminescence. Each object was documented in relation to its precise position in the sediment. The site did not suggest a sudden appearance of symbolic behavior, but rather a sequence where certain practices appeared, disappeared, and reappeared over time. The cave acted as a container for these shifts, holding them in place long enough to be studied. In Europe, limestone cave systems in Spain added another set of records. Atapuerca, near Burgos, is not a single cave but a complex of sites exposed by railway construction in the late 19th century. Systematic excavation in the second half of the 20th century revealed deep sequences at locations such as Grandolina and Cima del Elefante. Stone tools and hominin remains were found in layers dated to over 1 million years ago, using paleomagnetic analysis and other methods appropriate for deep time. The caves preserved deposits that would not have survived on open ground, allowing researchers to trace occupation back further than many surface sites permit. Asia's cave record is similarly diverse. Zhoukudian, near Beijing, became known in the early 20th century for remains attributed to Homo erectus. The cave complex included thick ash layers, stone tools, and animal bones, interpreted at the time as evidence of controlled fire use. Later studies revisited those interpretations, examining whether burning occurred in place or resulted from natural processes. Regardless of the conclusions about fire, the stratigraphic sequence remains a reference point for early human presence in East Asia. The site's history also reflects losses, as original fossils disappeared during World War II, leaving casts and descriptions as substitutes for direct study. In Siberia, Denisova Cave provided a different form of continuity. Excavations there documented layers spanning from the Middle Paleolithic into later periods. Bone fragments recovered from specific layers were subjected to genetic analysis decades after excavation, revealing the presence of a previously unrecognized hominin population. The cave sequence itself was already well mapped, with detailed sediment descriptions and dating. The genetic findings did not require reinterpretation of the stratigraphy. They were added to it. The cave had preserved material that gained new meaning as analytical tools advanced. Caves also preserve absences. Long gaps between occupation layers can indicate periods when conditions outside were unsuitable or when groups moved along different routes. These gaps are visible because sediment continues to accumulate slowly even when people are absent. In open-air sites, similar gaps are harder to detect because erosion can remove entire phases. In caves, thin layers of sterile sediment act as markers of time passing without habitation. These markers allow archaeologists to align human activity with environmental records from outside the cave, such as pollen cores and isotopic data. Naming in these contexts is informal and practical. Layers are labeled with letters or numbers, and assemblages are referred to by site codes. There are no written names from the people who lived there, only designations assigned by researchers. Yet patterns emerge that function like names in the record. Repeated tool forms, consistent raw material choices, and recurring spatial layouts. These patterns persist across layers and sometimes across regions, suggesting shared traditions maintained without writing. The caves hold these traditions in sequence, allowing comparison without narrative embellishment. The role of caves in preserving early human activity is therefore technical rather than symbolic. They are stable containers shaped by geology, not intention. Their importance lies in how they slow down the loss of information. Within their deposits, small actions accumulate into records that can be measured and remeasured. What survives is partial and often ambiguous, but it is anchored in place. The caves do not explain themselves. They require careful removal of sediment, cautious interpretation, and repeated verification. Over time, they have become reference points for understanding how far back human and pre-human activity extends, without relying on written memory, tools that outlasted the hands that made them. Stone tools remain the most durable traces of early human activity because they resist decay and chemical change. When wood, fibre, and skin disappear, worked stone often stays close to where it was dropped. Archaeologists document these objects by material, fracture pattern, edge angle, and the geological source of the stone itself. Each attribute is recorded in relation to its sediment layer, not as an isolated feature. A single flake can be dated only through its position, which is why excavation notes often matter as much as the artifact. The earliest widely recognized stone tools are associated with what is called the Oldowan industry. These assemblages appear in eastern Africa at sites such as Gona in Ethiopia, where artifacts were reported in sediments dated to about 2.6 million years ago. The tools consist mainly of simple flakes and cores produced by striking one stone against another. Their manufacture leaves characteristic bulbs of percussion and fracture lines that distinguish human action from natural breakage. At Gona and similar sites, the tools occur alongside animal bones bearing cut marks, suggesting use in processing carcasses. The context is narrow and specific, limited to small areas near ancient water sources. As time passes in the record, different tool forms appear. Acheulean hand axes, identified by their bifacial shaping and relative symmetry, are found across Africa and later in parts of Europe and Asia. Sites such as Konso in Ethiopia and Olojosele in Kenya preserve long Acheulean sequences within well-dated volcanic landscapes. The tools were made from locally available stone, but in some cases, raw materials were transported over distances exceeding 10 kilometers. That movement is inferred from geological matching between artifacts and source outcrops. The implication is logistical rather than symbolic, showing repeated planning tied to landscape use. In Europe, Acheulean tools appear later and in more limited distributions, often associated with river terrace deposits. At sites along the Thames in England and the Somme in France, hand axes were recovered from gravels laid down during specific interglacial periods. These gravels were dated through stratigraphic correlation, and later, through absolute dating techniques applied to overlying and underlying sediments. The tools themselves show variation in size and finish, which has been described in terms of local traditions rather than abrupt technological breaks. Many were likely discarded after short use, as suggested by edge wear patterns. Tool classification relies on repeatable criteria rather than assumed intention. Cores are described by the number of platforms and flake scars. Flakes are measured by length, width, and thickness. Retouch tools are identified by secondary modification along edges. These descriptions allow assemblages from different regions to be compared without assuming contact or shared identity. Similar forms can arise independently under similar constraints. The focus stays on what can be measured, not on inferred meaning. Middle Paleolithic assemblages, often associated with Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, show different reduction strategies. The Levallois technique, identified by prepared cores designed to produce flakes of predetermined shape, appears in multiple regions. Sites such as Levallois-Perret near Paris gave the method its name. But similar cores have been documented from North Africa to Central Asia. The technique is recognized through the geometry of the core and the relationship between the core surface and the detached flake. Its presence is tracked through stratified sequences rather than through isolated finds. Raw material studies add another layer of information. At sites like Boxgrove in England, detailed sourcing showed that flint was collected from specific exposures and used systematically. At other locations, such as the Middle Stone Age sites of southern Africa, quartzite, silcrete, and other stones were selected based on fracture properties. Heat treatment of stone, inferred from changes in surface texture and colour, has been documented at sites like Pinnacle Point. These observations rely on experimental replication and microscopic analysis rather than on narrative interpretation. In Asia, stone tool traditions vary widely depending on local geology. In parts of China and Southeast Asia, assemblages dominated by simple core and flake tools persist for long periods. Sites such as Bose Basin in southern China include large cutting tools associated with dated tektite layers from a meteorite impact around 780,000 years ago. The association between tools and impact debris provides an independent chronological marker. The tools themselves are described conservatively, without assuming a linear progression toward more complex forms. Australia presents a different pattern, with stone tools appearing relatively late in the global sequence. Sites such as Majid Baby in northern Australia contain artifacts dated to over 60,000 years ago using optically stimulated luminescence. The assemblages include ground-edge axes alongside flaked tools, indicating a combination of techniques. The dating relies on sediment analysis rather than on the tools alone, and interpretations focus on timing of arrival rather than on tool sophistication. Wear analysis contributes to understanding how tools were used. Microscopic examination of edges can reveal polish, striations, and microfractures consistent with cutting meat, scraping hides, or working plant materials. These traces are compared with experimental reference collections. The results are probabilistic, not definitive, and are reported with stated confidence levels. The same tool type can show different wear patterns depending on task, reinforcing the idea that form alone does not determine function. One recurring issue in tool studies is curation bias. Tools made of durable stone survive, while those made of perishable materials do not. This creates an uneven record that favors certain activities over others. Wooden implements, baskets, and cordage are known from rare preservation contexts such as waterlogged sites and frozen environments, but they are absent from most early sequences. As a result, stone tools may represent only a portion of technological systems that included many other components now lost. Collections assembled during early excavations were sometimes removed from their original contexts with limited documentation. Later researchers have re-examined these collections using updated methods, occasionally reassigning dates or classifications. Such revisions are documented in the literature through comparative studies and revised site reports. The process reflects the accumulation of detail rather than a shift in overarching narrative. Across continents and time periods, stone tools form a record that is both stable and incomplete. They persist because of their material properties, not because they were meant to endure. Their study depends on measured attributes, stratigraphic position, and careful comparison. What they show is continuity of practice under changing conditions, recorded without names or written explanation. The hands that shaped them are gone, but the marks left by repeated actions remain fixed in stone and sediment. Landscapes, altered without architecture. Long before permanent buildings appear in the archaeological record, landscapes show signs of repeated human use. These signs are not walls or foundations, but small and persistent modifications that accumulate over time. They are identified through spatial patterning, rather than through individual objects. Archaeologists reconstruct them by mapping artifact distributions, soil changes, and ecological indicators across defined areas. The evidence is subtle, and often only visible after careful measurement and comparison. One of the most common markers is the repeated placement of hearths. Hearths are identified by ash lenses, charcoal fragments, reddened sediment, and heat-altered stone. At sites such as Gesher Beno Yaakov in the Jordan Valley, clusters of burned material appear in consistent locations across multiple occupation layers. The hearths are separated by sterile sediment, indicating reuse of the same spots over long intervals rather than continuous burning. Their distribution suggests habitual organization of living space, even in the absence of constructed features. Similar patterns appear in open-air sites along ancient lakeshores and riverbanks. At Olorgesailie in Kenya, excavations revealed concentrations of stone tools, animal bones, and burned material arranged in recurring spatial relationships. The surrounding sediments were dated using volcanic layers, allowing the activity areas to be placed within a long chronological sequence. The landscape itself shows evidence of repeated use, with certain locations favored despite changes in water level and vegetation. The choices appear practical, tied to visibility, access to resources, and shelter from wind. Resource zones leave another kind of imprint. In many regions, stone tool assemblages cluster near specific raw material sources. Quarries and secondary workshops are identified through high densities of cores and early-stage flakes. At places like the flint outcrops of the Paris Basin or the silkrete sources along the South African coast, these concentrations recur across time periods. The stone sources themselves show minimal physical alteration, but the debris fields around them mark repeated extraction and tool preparation. These zones functioned as fixed points within larger movement systems. Animal processing areas can also be detected through patterned remains. At some Paleolithic sites, bones bearing cut marks and percussion damage cluster separately from primary habitation zones. This separation is interpreted cautiously, based on spatial analysis rather than assumption. At Boxgrove in England, for example, large mammal remains were found in association with stone tools in specific contexts within a broader landscape shaped by ancient shorelines. The distribution of remains aligns with natural features that would have influenced animal movement, suggesting that people repeatedly positioned themselves in predictable locations. Paths and movement corridors are harder to document, but indirect evidence exists. Repeated transport of stone from distant sources implies established routes, even if those routes left no visible trail. In the Ethiopian Rift, obsidian artifacts found far from their geological sources indicate movement along corridors shaped by topography and water availability. These corridors can be reconstructed by combining artifact sourcing with landscape modeling. The result is not a map of roads, but a probabilistic reconstruction of favored directions and stopping points. Vegetation changes sometimes reflect prolonged human presence. Pollen records taken near occupation sites can show shifts in plant composition over time. In some cases, increased representation of disturbance-tolerant species aligns with periods of repeated occupation. These shifts are subtle and require comparison with regional pollen records to distinguish local effects from broader climatic trends. The evidence is presented conservatively, acknowledging that natural processes can produce similar patterns. Fire use also alters landscapes beyond individual hearths. Repeated burning can affect soil chemistry and plant regeneration. In some regions, charcoal layers in sediment cores correspond with archaeological horizons, suggesting a link between human activity and localized fire regimes. At sites in Australia, for example, long-term charcoal records have been compared with evidence of human arrival and sustained presence. The interpretations focus on correlation rather than causation, noting that fire can be both a natural and a human-driven process. Water management leaves traces even without constructed features. Repeated use of springs, seeps, and shallow water crossings can compact soil and alter sediment deposition. At some sites, microstratigraphic analysis reveals trampled surfaces, identified through soil structure and particle orientation. These surfaces are often associated with artifact scatters and hearth remains, reinforcing the interpretation of habitual use. The changes are incremental and only detectable through detailed sediment analysis. Seasonal use of landscapes can be inferred from faunal remains. Age profiles of hunted animals and the presence of migratory species indicate timing of occupation. When similar seasonal patterns recur at the same locations, they suggest established cycles of movement. These cycles do not require permanent structures to leave a record. They are visible through repetition in the data rather than through any single dramatic feature. In coastal regions, shell middens provide a clearer marker of repeated activity. Even small accumulations of shell can indicate sustained use of a shoreline. At sites along the southern African coast, shell layers appear interspersed with stone tools and hearths. The composition of these middens reflects available species and harvesting practices. Their stratigraphic position allows them to be dated and compared with sea level reconstructions, linking human activity to changing coastal landscapes. The absence of architecture does not imply the absence of spatial organization. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer groups show that camps can be structured through placement of hearths, sleeping areas, and activity zones without permanent construction. Archaeologists use these observations cautiously, applying them only where the archaeological evidence supports similar patterning. The goal is not to project behavior backward, but to recognize recurring spatial signals when they appear. Erosion and later disturbance complicate the picture. Many early sites have been partially destroyed by water flow, animal activity, or later human land use. What remains is often a fragment of a larger pattern. Archaeological interpretation accounts for this by focusing on multiple sites across a region rather than relying on a single example. When similar spatial arrangements appear repeatedly, confidence increases that they reflect past behavior rather than chance preservation. Over long spans, these small modifications accumulate into recognizable landscapes of use. They do not announce themselves as monuments, and they can be overlooked without systematic survey and excavation. Their significance lies in persistence rather than scale. Each hearth stain, trampled surface, or quarry scatter is minor on its own. Together, they show how people interacted with their surroundings in ways that shaped movement and resource use without leaving permanent structures. The record of these altered landscapes depends on careful documentation and comparison. It is built from measured distances, map distributions, and dated sediments. The changes are quiet and often reversible, but they are detectable when examined closely. They demonstrate that long before cities or architecture, human and pre-human groups influenced their environments in consistent, measurable ways, leaving traces that can still be read in the ground. Dates that refuse to settle. Archaeological time is constructed through measurement, not assumption. Each date is attached to a sample, and each sample is taken from a defined context. When methods disagree, the disagreement becomes part of the record. Early archaeological chronologies were built using relative dating, comparing layers and tool types across sites. Absolute dating methods arrived later and did not replace older systems immediately. The resulting timelines were uneven and subject to revision. Radiocarbon dating, introduced in the late 1940s by Willard Libby, transformed archaeological practice by allowing organic materials to be dated directly. The method relies on the decay of carbon-14 and is effective up to roughly 50,000 years. Early results were treated cautiously because calibration curves were incomplete and contamination was poorly understood. Samples from the same layer could yield different ages depending on preparation and laboratory procedure. As a result, published dates often appeared as ranges rather than fixed points. One early example of disagreement emerged at Upper Paleolithic cave sites in Europe. Charcoal from hearths in French and Spanish caves produced radiocarbon dates that conflicted with expectations based on artifact typology. In some cases, art styles thought to be recent returned dates tens of thousands of years older. Chauvet Cave is a well-known case, where early radiocarbon results in the 1990 seconds suggested an age far earlier than most painted caves. Subsequent testing using multiple samples and methods confirmed the early dates, but the interval between initial report and broader acceptance illustrates how resistant established chronologies can be to adjustment. For older sites, beyond the effective range of radiocarbon dating, other methods were developed. Potassium-argon dating, and later argon-argon dating, allowed volcanic materials to be dated over millions of years. These methods were critical in East Africa, where hominin fossils and stone tools are often found between volcanic ash layers. At sites like Olduvai Gorge and Hadar, dates derived from these methods anchored early human activity deep in time. However, early potassium-argon results sometimes differed significantly between laboratories, leading to disputes over the age of key fossils and tool assemblages. Thermoluminescence and optically stimulated luminescence dating added further complexity. These methods date the last time minerals were exposed to heat or sunlight, making them useful for sediments and burned stone. They were applied to sites where organic material was absent or poorly preserved. At locations such as Majid Baby in Australia, luminescence dating produced ages that pushed human presence earlier than previously accepted. The results were scrutinized closely, with attention paid to sediment disturbance and exposure history. Repeated sampling and independent replication became standard practice in response. Paleomagnetic dating introduced another independent line of evidence. Changes in Earth's magnetic field are recorded in sediments and volcanic rocks, providing time markers when matched to the global geomagnetic polarity timescale. This method was used at sites like Atapuerca in Spain, where early human remains were found in deposits dated beyond the reach of radiocarbon. Paleomagnetic reversals provided broad age brackets rather than precise dates, but they offered a way to test other chronological claims. When different methods converged on similar ranges, confidence increased. Conflicts between dates often arose from sampling issues rather than from flaws in the methods themselves. Contamination by younger carbon, reworked sediments, or intrusion of materials from higher layers could skew results. In cave sites, burrowing animals and water flow sometimes displaced objects without obvious disturbance to the surrounding sediment. Early excavations did not always record microstratigraphy in enough detail to identify these processes. Later re-excavation or reanalysis of archived samples sometimes resolved apparent contradictions. Calibration also played a significant role. Radiocarbon years are not identical to calendar years, and early chronologies did not account fully for fluctuations in atmospheric carbon-14 levels. As calibration curves improved through tree ring studies and other datasets, previously published dates were adjusted. These recalibrations sometimes shifted site chronologies by thousands of years. The revisions did not invalidate the original measurements, but they changed their interpretation. Published literature reflects this process through updated tables and revised conclusions rather than through wholesale rejection of earlier work. Marine reservoir effects introduced additional uncertainty at coastal sites. Shells and marine organisms can appear older than they are because of delayed carbon exchange between the atmosphere and ocean. Without correction, radiocarbon dates from shell middens can be misleading. Archaeologists address this by comparing marine and terrestrial samples from the same layers and by applying region-specific correction factors. The need for such adjustments became clear only after inconsistencies were observed across multiple coastal sites. Chronological disputes were not limited to early prehistory. In some cases, historical records conflicted with radiocarbon results, prompting reassessment of both. The resolution often involved recognizing gaps or errors in the written record rather than dismissing the scientific dates. These episodes reinforce the principle that no single dating method stands alone. The accumulation of dates across regions gradually produced a denser chronological framework. Individual anomalies became easier to evaluate as comparative datasets expanded. When a date appeared out of sequence, it could be tested against regional patterns rather than treated in isolation. This comparative approach reduced the impact of outliers without eliminating uncertainty entirely. Disagreement remained a normal part of the process. Archaeological time therefore remains provisional. Published dates are accompanied by error margins and methodological descriptions, allowing others to reassess them. Reanalysis of old samples using new techniques is common, and revisions are expected. The persistence of disagreement does not imply failure. It reflects the difficulty of measuring deep time through fragmentary remains. Some claims gained attention because they were framed as suppressed or erased chronologies. In practice, most disputes unfolded openly in journals, conference proceedings, and site reports. Differences were documented rather than hidden, and alternative interpretations were preserved alongside prevailing views. The record of disagreement is visible in citation trails and revised stratigraphic diagrams. Dates that refuse to settle do so because they sit at the edge of method limits, or because their contexts are complex. Their instability becomes a feature of the evidence rather than an anomaly to be removed. Archaeological chronologies are built by accommodating this instability, layering measurements and revisions over time. The result is a timeline that remains open to adjustment, grounded in documented methods rather than in fixed narrative closure, remains that did not fit cleanly. Fossil and skeletal remains form a different kind of record from tools or sediments. They are individual, finite, and often incomplete. A single bone can carry a large interpretive weight because it is rare and difficult to place. Classification depends on comparative anatomy, measurements, and statistical ranges drawn from other specimens. When a find falls outside those ranges, it does not immediately create a new category. It usually creates a period of uncertainty. Early examples of this uncertainty appear throughout the history of paleoanthropology. In 1924, Raymond Dart described a juvenile skull from Taong, South Africa, later called Australopithecus africanus. At the time, many researchers rejected Dart's interpretation, arguing that the specimen was an ape rather than an early human relative. The brain size was small, and the fossil was a child. Only after additional Australopithecine fossils were recovered in southern and eastern Africa did the Taong specimen gain broader acceptance. The delay was not due to concealment, but to disagreement over anatomical criteria and comparative samples. Similar issues arose with fossils that showed mixed traits. At Olduvai Gorge, fragments attributed to Homo habilis displayed a combination of cranial features that overlapped with both Australopithecines and later Homo species. The designation itself reflected uncertainty, as habilis referred to tool use rather than to a clearly bounded anatomical category. Over time, different researchers reassigned specimens to Homo erectus, Australopithecus, or other proposed species based on revised metrics. The fossils remained the same, but their placement shifted as comparative frameworks changed. In Indonesia, remains from Java attributed to Homo erectus added another layer of complexity. Fossils collected from sites such as Trinil and Sangiran were recovered over decades, often from disturbed contexts. Early dating relied on associated fauna and stratigraphic correlation rather than on direct methods. As dating techniques improved, age estimates shifted. Some specimens appeared older or younger than previously thought, complicating models of dispersal and persistence. The classification of Asian Homo erectus has remained broad, partly because of this chronological uncertainty. Europe's Neanderthal record presents its own challenges. The first Neanderthal fossils, described in the 19th century, were initially interpreted as pathological modern humans. Only after additional finds accumulated did Neanderthals become recognized as a distinct population. Even then, variation within Neanderthal fossils led to debates about regional differences and possible subdivisions. Some skeletons showed robust features, while others appeared more gracile. These differences were documented through measurements rather than narrative explanation, and they remain part of the dataset rather than being resolved into a single form. The discovery of remains at Cima de los Huesos in Spain intensified these discussions. The site yielded a large assemblage of hominin bones dating to around 430,000 years ago. Anatomically, the remains showed traits associated with later Neanderthals, but they also retained features seen in earlier populations. Genetic analysis later indicated a closer relationship to Neanderthals than to other groups. But the anatomical mosaic remained. The fossils did not fit neatly into a linear progression. They occupied an intermediate position that required adjustment of existing categories. In Africa, fossils attributed to Homo naledi raised questions about association between anatomy and behavior. Discovered in the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, the remains displayed a mix of small-brained cranial features and hands and feet resembling those of later humans. The dating of the fossils, published after initial anatomical descriptions, placed them within a surprisingly recent time range, between about 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. This combination challenged assumptions about the relationship between brain size and complexity. The response in the literature focused on refining descriptions and contextual analysis, rather than on redefining the entire timeline. Asia added further complexity with the identification of Denisovans. Unlike other groups, Denisovans were recognized primarily through genetic material extracted from a finger bone and later from teeth found in Denisova Cave. The skeletal fragments themselves were insufficient for traditional anatomical classification. Genetic data showed that Denisovans were distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans, yet related to both. Additional evidence came from genetic traces in living populations, particularly in Melanesia and parts of Southeast Asia. The physical appearance of Denisovans remains largely unknown, illustrating how classification can proceed without a complete anatomical picture. Small-bodied hominins from Flores, Indonesia, known from Liangbua Cave, also resisted simple placement. The remains, often referred to as Homo floresiensis, included skulls and postcranial bones dated to tens of thousands of years ago. Their small stature and brain size prompted debate over whether they represented a distinct species or pathological modern humans. Detailed analysis of limb proportions, cranial morphology, and dental characteristics supported the interpretation of a separate population. The debate unfolded through measurements, replication studies, and comparisons with both fossil and modern samples. Dating and context played central roles in these discussions. Fossils removed from clear stratigraphic positions were harder to interpret. In some cases, remains collected during early excavations lacked precise contextual information, limiting their usefulness. Later discoveries, with better documentation, often clarified earlier ambiguities. When new dating placed fossils outside expected time ranges, the response was typically to reassess assumptions rather than to discard the data. Taphonomic processes further complicated interpretation. Crushing, distortion, and chemical alteration can change bone shape over time. Researchers account for these effects through reconstruction techniques and comparison with experimental models. Measurements are reported with margins of error, and reconstructions are presented as hypotheses rather than final forms. The language used to describe these remains reflects caution. Terms such as affinity, mosaic, and transitional appear frequently in the literature. These words indicate relationships without asserting direct ancestry. They acknowledge that evolutionary processes involve branching and overlap rather than simple replacement. Fossils that do not fit cleanly into existing categories often remain classified provisionally, awaiting additional evidence. Re-evaluation is common as new techniques emerge. Advances in imaging, isotopic analysis, and ancient DNA extraction have allowed old specimens to be studied in new ways. Some fossils have been reclassified decades after discovery, not because they were misunderstood initially, but because comparative datasets expanded. The process leaves a layered interpretive history attached to each specimen. What these remains collectively show is not a hidden or erased lineage, but a complex record shaped by preservation, discovery, and method. The difficulty of fitting them into tidy categories reflects the variability of past populations and the limits of classification systems. Each specimen adds constraints rather than answers, narrowing possibilities without closing them. The fossil record therefore remains open-ended. It is built from individual finds that resist simplification and require ongoing comparison. The lack of clean fit is not an anomaly. It is a predictable outcome of working with fragmentary evidence spread across deep time. Traces preserved outside the ground. Not all evidence of early populations is recovered through excavation. Some of the most informative traces are generated in laboratories or through remote measurement, independent of traditional digging. These traces do not replace artifacts or fossils, but they add parallel records that can be compared with what is found in sediment. Their value lies in how they operate under different constraints, relying on chemistry, physics, and computation rather than on visible form. Genetic data became a significant source of information in the late 20th century, when techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA improved. Early attempts were limited by contamination and degradation, producing inconsistent results. Over time, laboratory protocols were refined, and dedicated clean rooms reduced modern DNA intrusion. As a result, genetic material recovered from bone, tooth, dentin, and even sediment could be analyzed with greater confidence. Each sample was tied to a specific context, allowing genetic data to be integrated into established archaeological sequences. The first widely accepted ancient DNA sequences from hominin remains came from Neanderthals in the 1992. These sequences showed clear genetic differences from modern humans, while also indicating a shared ancestry. Later studies expanded the dataset and confirmed that limited interbreeding occurred between Neanderthals and populations ancestral to some modern humans. These findings were presented with statistical models and error margins, emphasizing population-level patterns rather than individual events. Genetics added a dimension of relationship without assigning cultural or technological meaning. Denisovan genetic material extended this approach further. The remains from Denisova Cave were fragmentary and provided little anatomical information, yet the extracted DNA revealed a distinct population. Subsequent studies identified Denisovan genetic contributions in present-day populations in Melanesia and parts of Southeast Asia. These conclusions were based on comparative genomics rather than on fossil morphology. The physical record at Denisova Cave remained essential for dating and context, but the genetic signal connected that site to regions far beyond its immediate surroundings. Sediment DNA introduced another layer of evidence. In some caves, genetic material from organisms, including hominins, can be recovered directly from sediment samples. This approach does not require identifiable bones. At sites such as Denisova Cave and others in Europe, sediment DNA has been used to confirm the presence of Neanderthals or Denisovans in specific layers. The method relies on careful sampling and controls, as DNA can move through sediments under certain conditions. Results are therefore interpreted conservatively, with attention to stratigraphic integrity. Isotopic analysis provides information about diet, mobility, and environment. Ratios of stable isotopes in bone collagen or tooth enamel reflect the types of foods consumed and the geological regions where an individual lived. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes have been used to distinguish between diets dominated by terrestrial plants, marine resources, or animal protein. Oxygen and strontium isotopes can indicate movement across different geological substrates. These methods have been applied to Neanderthal and early modern human remains, revealing variation within and between populations. At sites like Vindija Cave in Croatia and La Chapelle aux Saints in France, isotopic data contributed to discussions about subsistence strategies without relying solely on associated fauna. The results often showed flexible diets adapted to local conditions. Differences between individuals within the same site suggested varied life histories rather than uniform behavior. These findings were integrated with archaeological data, reinforcing interpretations drawn from tool assemblages and faunal remains. Remote sensing has expanded the scale at which archaeological landscapes can be studied. Techniques such as LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite imagery allow researchers to identify features that are difficult or impossible to see from the surface. In heavily forested regions, LiDAR has revealed patterns of ancient land use by removing vegetation digitally. While this approach is more commonly associated with later agricultural societies, it also contributes to understanding earlier occupation by identifying terrain features, erosion patterns, and potential site locations. In desert environments, satellite imagery has been used to trace paleoriver systems and ancient lake beds. These features help explain the distribution of early sites across regions now inhospitable. In the Sahara, for example, Remote sensing has identified former drainage networks that align with known archaeological localities. The data do not indicate settlement in the absence of ground verification, but they guide fieldwork and provide environmental context. Geochemical analysis of sediments offers another indirect record. Trace elements and mineral composition can reflect human activity, such as repeated burning or accumulation of organic waste. Phosphate analysis has been used to identify areas of prolonged occupation or animal processing. These chemical signatures persist even when visible artifacts are scarce. Interpretation depends on comparison with control samples and natural background levels, ensuring that human activity is distinguished from geological processes. Paleoenvironmental records extend beyond archaeological sites themselves. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve climate proxies that can be correlated with archaeological timelines. Variations in temperature and atmospheric composition are recorded independently of human activity. When these records are aligned with occupation sequences, they provide a broader framework for understanding movement and adaptation. Marine sediment cores and lake deposits offer similar records through pollen, microfossils, and isotopic signatures. The integration of these external records requires careful synchronization. Each dataset has its own resolution and uncertainty. Genetic divergence estimates depend on mutation rates, which are calibrated using independent data. Isotopic signals can be altered by diagenesis, requiring screening and correction. Remote sensing identifies features that must be verified on the ground. None of these methods stands alone. Their value emerges through comparison and cross-checking. One effect of these approaches is to reduce reliance on single, exceptional finds. A population can be inferred from genetic traces, even when fossils are rare. Movement patterns can be reconstructed from isotopes, even when sites are few. Environmental change can be documented independently of human presence. This distribution of evidence lowers the interpretive weight placed on any one object or site. The language used in reporting these findings reflects their auxiliary role. Genetic studies refer to probabilities and population structures. Isotopic analyses report ranges and averages. Remote sensing identifies anomalies and patterns rather than confirmed sites. Each discipline contributes information that is provisional and subject to revision as methods improve. These traces also highlight the limits of preservation. Genetic material degrades rapidly outside certain conditions, leaving large gaps in the record. Isotopic signals depend on the survival of suitable tissues. Remote sensing cannot recover information that was never physically imprinted on the landscape. The absence of data in these records does not imply absence of people, only absence of preservation or detection. By extending the evidentiary base beyond excavation, archaeology gains multiple perspectives on early populations. These perspectives operate independently, reducing the risk that a single interpretive framework dominates. The result is a more distributed form of evidence, where agreement between methods strengthens confidence and disagreement prompts further investigation. The traces preserved outside the ground do not reveal a hidden civilization or a complete alternative history. They refine existing timelines and relationships, filling gaps unevenly. Their contribution lies in adding constraints rather than narratives. Each dataset narrows the range of plausible interpretations without closing discussion. As these methods continue to develop, older samples are often revisited. Archived bones are reanalyzed genetically. Sediments are resampled with new techniques. Remote datasets are reprocessed with improved algorithms. The record grows not by replacement, but by accumulation, layering new information onto established contexts, gaps that grew larger with better evidence. As archaeological datasets expanded, expectations often shifted toward closure. More sites, more dates, and more methods were assumed to narrow uncertainty. In practice, the opposite sometimes occurred. New evidence widened gaps in time and space, revealing absences that were not visible before. These gaps were not empty by definition, but they resisted simple explanation. Their growth reflected improved resolution rather than missing work. One source of widening gaps came from recalibrated chronologies. As dating methods improved, older timelines were adjusted, sometimes pushing key events earlier or later than expected. When early Homo sapiens fossils from sites such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco were dated to around 315,000 years ago. Using thermoluminescence and other methods, they extended the known range of the species. This extension created temporal distance from other early Homo sapiens finds in eastern Africa, where comparable fossils appeared in younger contexts. The broader range complicated earlier models that assumed a single region or narrow timeframe for emergence. Geographic gaps also became more visible as surveys expanded into previously understudied regions. In parts of Central Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Arabian Peninsula, archaeological records remained sparse despite targeted fieldwork. Environmental conditions, including dense vegetation, acidic soils, and deep sedimentation, limited preservation and visibility. When sites were found, they often appeared isolated in time, separated by long intervals from other known occupations. These patterns raised questions about continuity that could not be resolved by existing data. The Arabian Peninsula illustrates this effect clearly. As remote sensing and field surveys increased in the early 21st century, stone tool assemblages were identified across desert landscapes previously thought to be uninhabited during early periods. Some sites suggested intermittent occupation during wetter climatic phases, dated through luminescence methods. However, the gaps between these phases remained large, spanning tens of thousands of years. The evidence supported episodic presence rather than continuous settlement, expanding the temporal framework without filling it in. In Europe, improved dating of Middle to Upper Paleolithic transitions produced similar outcomes. As radiocarbon calibration improved and new samples were tested, the overlap between Neanderthals and early modern humans appeared longer in some regions and shorter in others. Sites once thought to represent direct replacement were reinterpreted as reflecting alternating occupations, separated by sterile layers. The resulting picture included regional mosaics rather than a single transition line. The gaps between occupations became clearer as stratigraphic resolution increased. Island Southeast Asia provided another case where better evidence complicated interpretation. Excavations on islands such as Sulawesi, Timor, and Flores revealed early dates for human presence, often relying on luminescence dating of sediments. These dates extended the geographic reach of early populations, but left unanswered questions about roots and continuity. Between early arrival dates and later well-documented occupations, long intervals remained poorly represented. The sea crossings implied by early island sites contrasted with the scarcity of intermediate coastal evidence, highlighting a gap between capability and documentation. In the Americas, debates over early occupation have followed a similar pattern. As sites predating the Clovis complex were reported, including locations such as Monte Verde in Chile and Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in the United States, the temporal depth of human presence increased. Each new site added weight to the argument for earlier arrival. At the same time, the distribution of these sites remained uneven. Large areas produced no comparable evidence, and proposed migration routes lacked consistent archaeological signatures. The gap between entry and widespread occupation grew as earlier dates were accepted. Technological datasets contributed to widening gaps as well. When new analytical techniques distinguished previously grouped tool types, apparent continuity sometimes dissolved into separate traditions. Refined classification of Middle Stone Age industries in Africa revealed greater regional variability than earlier models suggested. Assemblages once treated as uniform were subdivided based on reduction strategies and raw material use. These distinctions implied parallel developments rather than a single trajectory, increasing conceptual distance between sites. Environmental records added further complexity. High-resolution climate proxies from ice cores and marine sediments revealed rapid fluctuations that did not align neatly with archaeological sequences. Periods of favorable climate did not always correspond with evidence of occupation, and some occupations occurred during less favorable intervals. The mismatch suggested that preservation, discovery bias, and local adaptation played larger roles than previously assumed. The gaps between environmental opportunity and archaeological visibility became more pronounced. Genetic evidence also introduced gaps at population scales. Divergence estimates based on ancient and modern DNA often produced broad ranges rather than precise dates. When genetic splits appeared older than the earliest known fossils, the discrepancy highlighted missing material rather than error. The absence of fossils matching genetic predictions did not invalidate either dataset, but it expanded the zone of uncertainty between them. These gaps were acknowledged as targets for future research rather than as anomalies. Methodological refinement itself contributed to the perception of gaps. As excavation techniques improved, archaeologists became more cautious about accepting disturbed or poorly documented contexts. Some earlier claims were set aside pending further verification, effectively removing data points from the accepted record. The resulting timelines appeared sparser, not because evidence had been lost, but because standards for inclusion had risen. This selective tightening made remaining gaps more visible. Preservation bias continued to shape the record unevenly. Regions with volcanic activity, caves, or stable sediments retained deeper sequences than those dominated by erosion or acidic soils. As global comparisons increased, these differences became harder to ignore. Apparent gaps in one region could reflect preservation limits rather than absence of activity. Acknowledging this did not fill the gaps, but it reframed them as structural features of the record. The expansion of datasets also exposed differences in research intensity. Areas with long traditions of fieldwork accumulated dense records, while others remained lightly sampled. When global syntheses were attempted, these disparities produced apparent gaps that mirrored funding, access, and historical focus. Recognition of this pattern led to targeted surveys, but results were incremental. Interpretive models adjusted in response. Linear narratives gave way to branching scenarios and region-specific histories. These models accommodated gaps by treating them as periods of low visibility rather than as definitive absences. The language of publication reflected this shift, emphasizing uncertainty and variability. Terms such as patchy, episodic, and discontinuous became common descriptors. In some cases, gaps grew because new discoveries redefined what counted as relevant evidence. Earlier models focused on particular tool types or fossil forms. As definitions broadened, previously excluded material was reconsidered, and new categories were introduced. This expansion altered comparisons with older datasets, creating apparent discontinuities that required reanalysis. The process added complexity, without immediate resolution. The widening of gaps did not signal a failure of archaeology. It signaled increased sensitivity to variation and context. As resolution improved, the record revealed its unevenness more clearly. What once appeared as a smooth sequence resolved into clusters separated by intervals of low visibility. Gaps that grew larger with better evidence remain open questions rather than closed problems. Their persistence encourages cautious interpretation and continued fieldwork. The record expands outward, and in doing so, it exposes the spaces between known points, accounts that changed after measurement. Interpretation in archaeology is constrained by measurement. When measurements change, interpretations follow, sometimes slowly. This process is visible in site reports that are revised over decades as new techniques are applied to old material. The changes rarely overturn the existence of a site or assemblage. Instead, they alter scale, timing, or association, reshaping how evidence is situated within broader frameworks. One early example involves the dating of European Upper Paleolithic sites excavated in the early 20th century. Many of these excavations produced rich collections of stone tools and art objects, but their chronological placement relied on typology and stratigraphic comparison. When radiocarbon dating became available, samples from these same layers were tested. The artifacts did not change, but their position in time did. Published syntheses were adjusted, and earlier phase labels were redefined or abandoned. At Olduvai Gorge, repeated measurement altered interpretations of tool associations. Early excavations described stone tools found near hominin, remains as evidence of direct manufacture by those individuals. Later work applied more refined stratigraphic analysis and spatial mapping, showing that some tools and fossils were separated by thin but distinct sediment layers. This separation suggested accumulation over time, rather than a single event. The revised interpretation did not remove tool use from the site, but it changed assumptions about immediacy and behavior. Measurement also reshaped views of early fire use. At Zhoukoudian in China, thick ash deposits were long cited as evidence of habitual fire control by Homo erectus. Subsequent micromorphological studies examined ash particles, mineral alteration, and sediment composition in detail. The results suggested that some burning could be attributed to natural processes such as roof collapse and later combustion. The site retained evidence of fire, but the scale and regularity of use were revised downward. This change emerged from mineral analysis rather than from reinterpretation of artifacts alone. In South Africa, the dating of Middle Stone Age sites underwent similar revision. At Clayse's river mouth, early chronologies place certain layers later than comparable assemblages elsewhere. Improved dating methods, including luminescence techniques, adjusted these timelines. As dates shifted, interpretations of technological development were recalibrated. Behaviors once thought to appear abruptly were reinterpreted as part of longer, regionally variable sequences. The change was quantitative, driven by new measurements, rather than qualitative. Measurement affected interpretations of symbolic artifacts as well. Engraved ochre pieces from Blombos Cave were initially discussed within a narrow chronological window. Subsequent refinement of stratigraphic boundaries and dating expanded that window. The engravings remained the same, but their temporal distribution widened. This adjustment altered discussions about frequency and recurrence, without changing the description of the objects themselves. The revised accounts focused on patterning over time, rather than on singular innovation. Fossil interpretation also shifted with improved measurement. Cranial capacity estimates for early hominins were refined as imaging techniques improved. Computed tomography allowed internal volumes to be measured more accurately, correcting earlier estimates based on external dimensions. In some cases, revised brain size measurements narrowed perceived differences between specimens previously assigned to different categories. The taxonomic labels were reconsidered, not because of new fossils, but because of more precise internal measurement. The reassessment of Homo floresiensis illustrates how measurement influenced debate. Initial descriptions emphasized small brain size and stature. Subsequent studies applied detailed morphometric analysis, comparing limb proportions and cranial features across large datasets. Measurement supported the interpretation of a distinct population adapted to island conditions. Alternative explanations invoking pathology were evaluated through comparative metrics rather than dismissed outright. The debate progressed through numerical comparison rather than rhetorical argument. Measurement also changed interpretations of site formation. At open-air sites along river terraces, early interpretations assumed single-occupation events. Later, sedimentological analysis revealed complex depositional histories, including flooding and reworking. Grain size distribution, particle orientation, and chemical signatures indicated multiple episodes of deposition. As a result, artifact assemblages were reinterpreted as palimpsests rather than snapshots. The revised accounts emphasized accumulation and mixing over time. Isotopic measurement altered views of diet and mobility. At several Neanderthal sites, nitrogen isotope ratios suggested high reliance on animal protein. Later studies expanded sample sizes and applied improved correction methods, revealing greater dietary variability. Some individuals showed isotopic signatures consistent with mixed diets or seasonal shifts. The revised interpretations did not deny hunting, but they complicated earlier generalizations. Measurement broadened the picture rather than narrowing it. Genetic measurement prompted some of the most visible reinterpretations. Early models of human evolution emphasized replacement with limited interaction. As more genomes were sequenced, evidence of interbreeding between modern humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans accumulated. The measurements did not support a single narrative of isolation or continuity. Instead, they indicated repeated contact at different times and places. The interpretation shifted from discrete populations to overlapping ones, guided by statistical analysis of genetic variation. Chronological measurement also reshaped interpretations of dispersal. Improved dating of sites in Arabia and South Asia extended the time frame of early Homo sapiens' presence outside Africa. These dates did not immediately clarify roots or continuity. Instead, they required models to accommodate earlier, possibly short-lived movements. The revised accounts emphasized episodic dispersal rather than a single expansion. Measurement expanded temporal possibilities without resolving spatial gaps. Measurement sometimes reduced the perceived significance of particular finds. These revisions were documented in site reports and meta-analyses. The process did not erase the finds from the record. It repositioned them within more consistent sequences. The emphasis shifted from exception to variation within known ranges. Reanalysis of museum collections contributed to changing accounts. Artifacts excavated decades earlier were measured using modern techniques, including surface scanning and residue analysis. Some tools were reclassified based on new criteria. Others were shown to have been altered post-depositionally. These findings adjusted interpretations of assemblage composition and function. The original excavation data remained valuable, but their interpretation evolved. Measurement also clarified negative evidence. At some sites, absence of certain features was once attributed to preservation loss. Later analysis showed that sediments were well preserved and capable of retaining those features. The absence therefore became informative, indicating that certain activities did not occur at those locations. This shift relied on micromorphology and experimental comparison rather than on assumption. The cumulative effect of these revisions is visible in the literature as layered interpretation. Early accounts remain cited, but they are annotated with later measurements and corrections. Chronologies include multiple date ranges with explanations. Behavioral interpretations are framed as provisional. The changes are not hidden. They are tracked through footnotes, appendices, and updated figures. Accounts that change after measurement do so because measurement constrains interpretation. As methods improve, the range of acceptable explanations narrows or shifts. This process does not produce a final account. It produces a record of adjustment. Each revision leaves a trace, marking where understanding was refined. The discipline accommodates these changes by emphasizing method over narrative. The process is cumulative and uneven, reflecting differences in preservation, sampling, and technique. The result is a body of knowledge that remains open to correction. Accounts are not fixed statements, but working summaries anchored to measured evidence. Their change over time reflects the expansion of measurement rather than the replacement of ideas. The record grows through recalibration, not through erasure. Claims that persisted without resolution. Some archaeological claims remain unresolved, not because evidence is absent, but because available evidence supports multiple interpretations without clearly excluding alternatives. These claims persist across decades of study, reanalysis, and methodological change. They appear repeatedly in reviews and syntheses as open questions rather than as settled conclusions. Their persistence reflects the limits of the record rather than reluctance to decide. One such claim concerns the timing and nature of the earliest stone tool production. While sites like Gona and Lomekwi have produced very early stone artifacts, disagreement remains over how these tools should be interpreted in behavioral terms. At Lomekwi in Kenya, stone artifacts dated to approximately 3.3 million years ago were described as intentionally produced. Some researchers emphasized fracture patterns consistent with deliberate knapping, while others noted similarities to naturally fractured stone. The debate has continued through experimental replication and microscopic analysis, yet no single criterion has resolved it conclusively. The artifacts remain dated, catalogued, and described, but their place in behavioral models is still provisional. Another persistent issue involves early fire use. Evidence for controlled fire appears sporadically across sites dated to more than 1 million years ago, including locations in Africa, the Levant, and East Asia. Burned sediments, heated stone, and altered bone are present in some contexts, but distinguishing habitual control from opportunistic use or natural burning remains difficult. At sites such as Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, microscopic analysis has supported in situ burning at depth. Elsewhere, similar signatures are ambiguous. The claim that fire was regularly controlled at a specific time remains unresolved because criteria vary and preservation is uneven. Questions surrounding early dispersals out of Africa also persist. Fossil and archaeological evidence suggests multiple movements rather than a single event, but the timing and routes of these dispersals remain debated. Sites in the Levant and Arabia provide evidence for early presence, yet long gaps separate these sites from later, more continuous records in Eurasia. Genetic models support repeated expansions and contractions, but aligning these models with sparse archaeological data has proven difficult. The claim that early populations established lasting settlements outside Africa before later expansions remains open. In Europe, the nature of the transition between Neanderthals and early modern humans continues to resist resolution. Despite extensive excavation and dating, regional variation complicates interpretation. Some areas show apparent overlap, while others suggest replacement with little temporal intersection. Tool industries associated with this period, such as the shuttle Peronian, have been interpreted as evidence of cultural transmission, independent innovation, or misattribution. Each interpretation is supported by specific datasets, yet none excludes the others entirely. The question of symbolic behavior in early populations is similarly unsettled. Objects such as engraved ochre, perforated shells, and modified bone appear intermittently in Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic contexts. Their interpretation depends on criteria for symbolism, intentionality, and repetition. Some researchers argue for continuity of symbolic behavior, while others emphasize episodic appearance. The artifacts themselves are securely documented, but their broader significance remains debated because symbolic meaning cannot be directly measured. Island colonization presents another unresolved set of claims. Early dates for human presence on islands such as Flores and Luzon suggest sea crossings earlier than previously assumed. The archaeological record confirms presence but provides limited information about the technologies involved. Watercraft do not preserve, and coastal sites are often submerged. The claim that early populations possessed consistent maritime capabilities remains plausible, but difficult to demonstrate directly. The evidence supports possibility rather than certainty. In the Americas, debates over the earliest occupation continue despite decades of research. Sites predating the Clovis complex have been reported, and in some cases, widely accepted. However, their geographic distribution remains sparse, and proposed migration routes lack consistent archaeological markers. Genetic evidence suggests earlier entry than once thought, but archaeological confirmation is uneven. The claim of widespread pre-Clovis occupation persists alongside acknowledgement of large gaps in the record. Chronological disagreements also persist, where dating methods approach their limits. Luminescence dating at deep time ranges, for example, carries uncertainties related to sediment exposure history and dose rate estimation. At some sites, different samples from the same layer yield overlapping, but not identical age ranges. These discrepancies do not invalidate the dates, but they prevent precise placement. Claims based on narrow temporal windows therefore remain unresolved. The classification of certain hominin fossils continues to generate debate. Specimens displaying mosaic traits challenge existing categories, and different analytical approaches emphasize different features. Some researchers favor splitting populations into multiple species, while others prefer broader classifications. Genetic data are unavailable for many of these fossils, limiting independent testing. The claim that the hominin tree is oversegmented or undersegmented remains unresolved because it depends on taxonomic philosophy as well as measurement. Environmental interpretations introduce further uncertainty. Correlating occupation with specific climatic phases relies on aligning independent records with different resolutions. In some cases, occupation appears during periods thought to be unfavorable, challenging assumptions about environmental constraints. Whether these instances reflect local adaptation, microclimates, or dating mismatch remains unclear. The claims persist because the data allow multiple explanations. Preservation bias underlies many unresolved issues. Regions with poor preservation may appear unoccupied, while better preserved regions dominate models. Acknowledging this bias does not correct it. Claims about absence or rarity remain provisional until preservation conditions change or new methods emerge. The uneven global record ensures that some questions remain open. The management of unresolved claims follows established conventions. Researchers document competing interpretations, specify assumptions, and outline evidentiary limits. Reviews often present multiple models side by side rather than selecting one. This approach maintains clarity about what is known and what is uncertain. Persistence of a claim does not imply endorsement, only continued relevance. Some claims endure because they sit at the intersection of multiple incomplete datasets. Resolving them would require simultaneous advances in excavation, dating, preservation, and analytical technique. Until such convergence occurs, the claims remain suspended between possibilities. The presence of unresolved claims does not weaken the archaeological record, it defines its boundaries. These claims function as reference points for future work, guiding where effort and resources are directed. Their continued discussion reflects the discipline's preference for measured uncertainty over premature closure. Over time, some persistent claims will be resolved through accumulation of evidence or methodological innovation. Others may remain open indefinitely due to irreversible loss of material. The record accommodates both outcomes. What persists is not a mystery narrative, but a structured acknowledgement of limits. Claims that persist without resolution remain part of the working framework of archaeology. They are recorded, revisited, and constrained by evidence, even when they cannot be settled. Their persistence reflects the fragmentary nature of deep history and the discipline's commitment to documenting uncertainty rather than erasing it. Records that survived only by chance. Much of what is known about deep human and pre-human history exists because certain materials happen to avoid destruction. Survival was not uniform or predictable. It depended on local chemistry, rapid burial, and environmental stability. Archaeologists recognize that the record is shaped as much by what endured as by what was once widespread. Chance preservation does not create false evidence, but it determines which evidence remains available for study. One of the clearest examples comes from frozen environments. In permafrost regions of Siberia and Alaska, organic materials survived that would decay elsewhere. At sites along the Yana River in northern Siberia, worked ivory, bone tools, and animal remains were preserved in frozen sediments dated to around 32,000 years ago. The survival of these materials allowed detailed reconstruction of subsistence and technology. The difference lies in temperature and burial conditions, not behavior. Waterlogged environments produce another selective record. In anaerobic conditions, wood, plant fibers, and soft tissues can survive for long periods. At sites such as Schöningen in Germany, wooden spears were preserved in saturated sediments associated with an ancient lakeshore. The spears were dated to approximately 300,000 years ago and showed clear shaping and balance. Their preservation depended on rapid burial in wet conditions. Without that environment, the tools would have disappeared, leaving no direct evidence of wooden hunting implements. Caves occasionally produce comparable preservation under specific conditions. In dry cave systems, desiccation can slow decay. In the American Southwest, perishable artifacts such as sandals, baskets, and cordage survived in arid shelters for thousands of years. These finds are much later than early Paleolithic contexts, but they illustrate the principle. Perishable technologies are likely underrepresented in older periods because the environments that preserve them are rare and unevenly distributed. Volcanic activity has also preserved records accidentally. Rapid burial by ash conceals surfaces and objects in place. At Laetoli in Tanzania, hominin footprints were preserved in volcanic ash dated to about 3.66 million years ago. The prints survived because ash fell, was compacted by rain, and was then buried by additional layers. The individuals who made the prints left no skeletal remains at that location. Without the ash, their passage would have left no trace. Similarly, volcanic tuffs have preserved occupation surfaces at early sites across East Africa. These sites appear unusually clear compared to others of similar age. Their clarity reflects geological circumstance rather than behavioral difference. Comparable activities likely occurred in regions without volcanic deposition, where surfaces were later disturbed or destroyed. Anoxic lake beds and peat deposits provide another selective archive. In some cases, pollen, plant remains, and even insect fragments survive, offering environmental context alongside archaeological material. These records help reconstruct landscapes that supported early populations. Their preservation depends on water saturation and chemical stability. Drying or oxygen exposure would erase much of this information. As a result, environmental reconstructions are often more detailed in regions with suitable depositional environments. Chance also influences fossil preservation. Skeletal remains survive only when burial occurs quickly enough to protect bones from scavengers and weathering. Many individuals leave no fossil trace. Those that do often died near depositional environments such as floodplains, caves, or sinkholes. The concentration of fossils in certain regions reflects these conditions rather than population density. Areas without such settings may appear empty despite long-term occupation, The Cima de los Huesos site in Spain illustrates this effect. A deep cave chamber accumulated a large number of hominin bones over time, preserved in stable conditions. The assemblage is exceptional in size and completeness. Its existence depends on a specific geological configuration that trapped remains. Without that configuration, knowledge of that population would be far more limited. The site is informative precisely because it is unusual. Chance also affects what is discovered. Construction projects, mining and quarrying have exposed many important sites. Atapuerca was revealed by railway construction. Jocodion was investigated after quarrying activity exposed fossil-bearing deposits. These discoveries were not the result of systematic survey alone. They depended on human alteration of the landscape in recent times. Countless sites likely remained buried or were destroyed before documentation. Early excavations introduced another layer of chance. Methods varied widely, and recovery was often incomplete. Small artifacts, botanical remains, and microfauna were frequently overlooked. Later re-excavation with finer techniques sometimes revealed additional material in previously excavated areas. The difference reflects methodological evolution rather than original absence. What survives in collections is partly a function of what earlier excavators chose or were able to recover. Museum curation further shaped the record. Objects that were collected and stored under stable conditions survived for future study. Others were lost, damaged, or separated from their documentation. During periods of conflict and institutional change, collections were moved or destroyed. The loss of original Jocodion fossils during World War II is a well-known example. Casts and descriptions remain, but direct analysis is no longer possible. Preservation bias also affects chronological interpretation. Periods with favourable preservation conditions appear richer in evidence than others. This can create the impression of population increase or behavioural change where none occurred. Archaeologists address this by comparing site density with preservation potential. But adjustments are approximate. The uneven survival of evidence cannot be fully corrected. Chance preservation complicates comparison between regions. A single waterlogged site may yield abundant organic artifacts, while dozens of dry sites yield only stone. Interpreting technological diversity requires accounting for this imbalance. The absence of perishable tools in most early contexts does not indicate their absence in practice. It indicates the rarity of conditions that allow them to survive. Accidental preservation also influences genetic evidence. Ancient DNA survives only under limited conditions, typically in cold, dry, or stable environments. As a result, genetic records are concentrated in certain regions. The absence of genetic data from tropical areas reflects degradation rather than lack of past populations. This uneven survival shapes models of population history and limits their resolution. The role of chance extends to environmental records. Ice cores, lake sediments, and marine deposits preserve continuous sequences that are rare elsewhere. These records provide high-resolution climate data that can be aligned with archaeological timelines. Their existence depends on stable accumulation over long periods. Without them, understanding of environmental context would be far more limited. Archaeologists acknowledge that chance preservation creates a partial and biased record. This acknowledgement does not undermine the validity of surviving evidence. It places constraints on interpretation. Claims are framed with awareness that what is visible represents a subset of past activity filtered by survival conditions. Efforts to mitigate these effects include targeted survey in underrepresented environments, development of methods to detect subtle traces, and reanalysis of existing collections. These approaches expand the record incrementally. They do not eliminate chance, but they reduce its impact by increasing coverage. The influence of chance also explains why some discoveries appear sudden or transformative. A well-preserved site can alter understanding because it provides information previously unavailable. The change reflects new access rather than new behavior. Recognizing this distinction helps maintain proportional interpretation. Records that survived only by chance form the backbone of deep history. Their existence is contingent, but their analysis is systematic. Archaeology proceeds by extracting as much information as possible from what remains, while remaining aware of what has been lost. The record is not complete, and it was never meant to be. Its gaps and concentrations are products of preservation, discovery, and time. Understanding the role of chance allows interpretation to remain grounded. It shifts emphasis away from exceptional narratives and towards structural constraints. What is known is framed as contingent knowledge, derived from materials that happen to endure. This perspective does not diminish the evidence. It defines its scope, what the record allows, and what it withholds. The archaeological record does not operate as a complete archive. It is a constrained system shaped by survival, discovery, and method. What it allows is determined by what remains in place long enough to be recovered and measured. What it withholds is shaped by decay, disturbance, and the limits of detection. Understanding this boundary is part of the discipline itself. It defines the difference between evidence and speculation. The record allows description of materials that endure. Stone, fired clay, mineralized bone, and certain sediments persist under a wide range of conditions. These materials can be dated, measured, and compared. From them, archaeologists can establish sequences of presence, absence, and change. They can describe where objects appear in relation to one another and to their surrounding layers. This spatial and temporal positioning forms the core of archaeological knowledge. It also allows reconstruction of patterns through repetition. When similar tools appear across multiple sites within comparable contexts, a pattern is established. When hearths recur in consistent spatial arrangements, organization can be inferred. When isotopic values cluster within defined ranges, aspects of diet or mobility can be outlined. These reconstructions rely on accumulation rather than on single finds. Their strength comes from convergence across independent observations. Chronology is another area where the record allows firm constraints. Even when dates are revised, they remain anchored to physical samples and documented contexts. The record permits the placement of events within ranges, if not exact points. It allows relative ordering of layers and association of materials within those layers. This ordering constrains interpretation by ruling out sequences that conflict with measured relationships. The record allows recognition of variability. Differences between regions, sites, and assemblages are visible because they are preserved in material form. This variability challenges simple narratives but provides a more accurate representation of past diversity. It allows comparison without requiring uniformity. The existence of multiple technological traditions or anatomical forms within overlapping timeframes is documented through this preserved variation. At the same time, the record withholds large categories of information. Perishable materials are mostly absent. Wood, textiles, skin, and plant-based tools rarely survive beyond specific environments. Stone tools may represent only a fraction of the objects once in use. The record does not indicate proportion. It indicates survival. Language and social structure are also withheld. No direct evidence records spoken language, naming systems, or social roles. Inferences drawn from material organization remain indirect. Spatial patterning can suggest cooperation or division of activity, but it cannot reveal social identities or meanings attached to those activities. Intentionality is another withheld dimension. Archaeology can document what was done, not why it was done. Repeated behaviors can be identified, but motivation cannot be recovered in measurable form. Even symbolic artifacts resist definitive interpretation because meaning is not preserved alongside material form. The record allows description of modification, placement, and recurrence, but not internal reasoning. The record also withholds complete continuity. Long gaps appear between occupations at many sites. These gaps may reflect absence of people, lack of preservation, or lack of discovery. The record does not distinguish between these possibilities without additional context. As a result, continuity must be inferred cautiously. Absence of evidence remains ambiguous. Geographic coverage is uneven. Regions with favorable preservation and long research histories dominate the dataset. Other areas remain sparsely documented. This imbalance shapes global models by weighting them towards certain landscapes. The record allows comparison only where comparable data exist. Where it does not, silence remains. The limits of dating further constrain interpretation. All chronological methods carry margins of error. At greater depths of time, these margins widen. Overlapping ranges can accommodate multiple scenarios. The record allows placement within intervals, but not always sequencing within those intervals. Fine-grained temporal narratives exceed what measurement can support. The archaeological record also withholds individual life histories in most cases. Skeletal remains provide limited information about age, health, and sometimes movement. They do not preserve personal experience or social relationships. Even well-preserved individuals represent isolated data points rather than complete biographies. Aggregation across individuals provides population-level trends, not individual narratives. Claims about civilizations before humanity are shaped by these boundaries. The record allows identification of hominin populations, technologies, and adaptations extending deep into time. It allows documentation of planning, toolmaking, and environmental interaction long before written history. It does not allow confirmation of complex social institutions, governance structures, or symbolic systems in the absence of material correlates. Where such correlates are missing, claims exceed what the record supports. The idea of erasure must also be constrained by what the record withholds. Loss of evidence is common and expected. Erosion, submergence, and decay remove information continuously. This loss is structural rather than intentional. The record does not preserve traces of removal or suppression unless those actions leave material signatures. In most cases, absence reflects preservation limits rather than active deletion. Methodological caution arises from these constraints. Archaeological interpretation emphasizes what can be demonstrated through context and measurement. When multiple explanations fit the same data, they are presented as alternatives rather than resolved prematurely. This tolerance is a feature, not a failure. The record allows correction over time. New methods applied to old material can refine or alter interpretation. Redating, remeasurement, and reanalysis adjust understanding without discarding earlier work. This capacity for revision reflects the record's openness rather than instability. What is allowed expands as techniques improve, but always within material limits. The boundaries of inference are therefore defined by material survival and analytical reach. Claims that remain within these boundaries can be evaluated, replicated, and revised. Claims that extend beyond them cannot be tested and remain outside the record. The distinction is methodological, not ideological. Understanding what the record withholds is essential for proportional interpretation. It prevents extrapolation beyond evidence and maintains clarity about uncertainty. It also highlights where future discoveries or methods could add information. Gaps become targets for investigation, rather than spaces to be filled by assumption. The archaeological record is not silent, but it is selective. It speaks through what endures and remains measurable. Its statements are constrained, partial, and often indirect. Within those limits, it provides a structured account of deep time. Outside them, it offers no confirmation or denial. What the record allows is cumulative knowledge, grounded in material context. What it withholds is equally important, defining the edge of that knowledge. Together, these boundaries shape how claims about deep past populations are framed and evaluated. The discipline proceeds by respecting both sides of that boundary, building understanding where evidence permits and stopping where it does not. If you enjoyed this video, you can support the channel by giving it a like. If you want more calm, long-form documentaries like this, consider subscribing. New videos are added regularly. You can also share your thoughts in the comments below.